Hey, welcome back to our study on relationship goals God's way. Over the last couple of weeks, we've looked at love, letting love reign in all of our relationships. We've looked at humility, having humility in all of our relationships. Last week, we looked at the tough topic of forgiveness. If you missed any of those, I encourage you to check them out on video or go on our website and you can see the full sermons on those. Today, I want to talk to you about a fourth key component of having relationships God's way, and that's having an uncommon commitment. You know, it's easy to be common. It's hard to be uncommon. And as God's children, if we're going to have relationships God's way, we're going to have an uncommon commitment. I love what John Stott said this. He said this. He said, every Christian should be both a conservative and a radical. Conservative in preserving and holding the faith, but radical in applying it. Now think about that. We have to be both conservatives and radicals. We have to be conservatives to hold the faith, but then radical in applying our faith. And so when it comes to relationship goals, one of the ways we radically apply our faith is to have an uncommon commitment, a commitment to others that's different than the world's. And so I want to give you today just a few key thoughts, and we're going to be in Romans chapter 12, verse 9 to 21, if you want to open your Bibles there. And I want to just walk you through 7 keys to having an uncommon commitment. Here's number 1. You ready? An uncommon commitment in our relationships means that we are both a lover and a hater. We have to have an uncommon love. Listen to what Paul says in Romans chapter 12, verse 9. He says, love must be sincere, hate what is evil, and cling to what is good. So that's the first point. If you and I are going to have an uncommon commitment in our relationships, we've got to be both a lover and a hater. Well, you say, what does that mean? Well, in all of my relationships, I want to love those things that are good for my relationships. Man, when I focus on my wife or focus on my friends or focus on God's Word, those are all things that I should love. Speaking the truth in love, doing positive deeds, those are things that I should love. But at the same time, in our relationships, I want to be a hater. I want to hate things that destroy my relationships. I want to hate immorality. I want to hate harsh words. I want to hate my priorities when they're out of whack. So I want to learn in my relationships to be both a lover and a hater. I want to love those things that are good for my relationships and hate those things that are bad. And when I say hate, that means keep them out. Keep them out of your relationship. So number 1, if you're going to have an uncommon commitment, you have to have an uncommon love. You have to be both a lover of those things that are good for our relationships and a hater of those things that are bad. Here's number 2. Paul in verse 11 says we also have to have an uncommon passion. An uncommon passion. We have to serve God with passion. We can look around and it's easy if we aren't careful to have a passion about a lot of things. But if we're going to have God-honoring relationships, if we're going to have relationship goals God's way, it starts with our relationship with God. We have to be passionate about our relationship with God first, and then our relationship with others second. I love what Paul says in Romans chapter 12, verse 11. He says, never lacking in zeal, but keep your spiritual fervor alive in serving the Lord. Man, did you hear that? Man, in everything that I do, I have to be passionate first and foremost about my relationship with God. And I love that word fervor and zeal, those 2 words. I want to have a fervor for the Lord. I want to have a zeal for the Lord. In other words, as God's children, a totally committed believer and follower of Jesus Christ is never dull, is never dull. I love what C.S. Lewis said. C.S. Lewis, that atheist at one point, that agnostic at one point, great philosopher, after grappling with the reality of the resurrection and the claims of Jesus Christ to be who He was, C.S. Lewis at one point went from being an atheist to a follower of Jesus Christ, a believer. And the natural question was, as he began to write and change his writing style and speaking style to talk about how God was number 1 in his life and his following Jesus Christ was number 1 in his life, someone kind of asked him the question. He says, hey, the way you talk about your love for God and love for Christ, does it make your wife jealous? And so he pretty much responded, he goes, let me tell you what, you might think it might make her jealous, but it doesn't. Because he says, when I learn to put the first things first, it doesn't make the second things lesser. It actually raises them up. In other words, here's what he's saying. C.S. Lewis was saying that if I have a zeal for the Lord and I put God first, and I honor God in everything I say and everything I do and all my activities and all of my actions, he goes, then I'm naturally also going to love my wife better and love my kids better and love my friends better. So he's saying when we put the first things first, our relationship with God, he goes, all it does is it draws our wives and our friendships and our kids up to a higher level. It doesn't suppress them. So that's number 2. Here's number 3. Not only that, we need to have an uncommon faith in tough times. I'll just put it to you this way. It wasn't Journey that first said, don't stop believing. It was the Apostle Paul. Let me read it to you first. In Romans chapter 12, verse 12, Paul says, don't stop believing. He says, be joyful in hope, patient in affliction, and faithful in prayer. You know what he was saying? When you're in tough times in a relationship, don't stop believing. If you're in tough times with your kids and, man, you have a prodigal son or a prodigal daughter, don't stop believing. If things look hopeless, the Apostle Paul says, don't stop believing. Whatever you do, don't stop believing. So he says, listen, he says, be joyful in hope, trusting that God is going to do something special. And then he says, be patient in affliction. In other words, sometimes those hard times last. Boy, I wish my problems came and went in the same day. But they don't. And my guess is there are seasons in your life, maybe you're in one right now, that you wish the troubles would just go away. Paul says, be patient. God's going to work them to the good. And then he gives us another idea. He says, be faithful in prayer. In other words, if you have a relationship and you've done everything you can do and it's still not going well, just pray. Pray and trust God. In other words, Paul says, don't ever stop believing. If you've got a wayward child, don't ever stop believing. If you've got a mate, don't ever stop believing. If you've got a difficulty in another relationship, friendship, don't stop believing. Here's the 4th thing he says right there in verse 13. He says, relationship God's way requires an uncommon generosity. We have to be generous with those around us. I love what Paul says. He says, share with the Lord's people who are in need and practice hospitality. In other words, if you look around and you have a relationship and someone's going through struggles or they're going through a hardship, maybe it's financial or maybe it's some other way, share your time with them. Share your resources with them. Provide your wisdom to them. And he says, don't just think about it, but he says, actually practice hospitality. In other words, it's one thing for us to know what to do, but if we never do it, we're never going to improve the relationship. So that's number 4, show an uncommon generosity. Here's number 5. Now I want you to know this is a hard one. You ready for it? Number 5, we have to have an uncommon endurance. In other words, we have to have strength with hard people in hard times. The truth is, sometimes people are just hard to live with. They're just hard to live with. Notice what Paul says in Romans chapter 12, verse 14. He says, bless those who persecute you. Bless and do not curse. He says, rejoice with those who rejoice and mourn with those who mourn. In other words, we have to have strength with hard people in hard times. You know, he says, bless those who persecute you. Not everybody's going to like you. Not everybody at the office or in the neighborhood or sometimes even in your house is going to like you. But Paul says we have to endure hard people during hard times. Taylor Swift a couple of years ago sang that old song, haters gonna hate, hate, hate. All you can do is shake it off, shake it off. That's what the Apostle Paul said a long time ago. There are going to be some times and some people, they curse you, they're angry with you, they're bitter at you, and you're going to sit there and go, what did I do? And the truth is you may well have done nothing. But Paul says he encourages you for the good of that relationship to hang in there, to show some endurance. And when they hate, just shake it off. Just shake it off. And so I just want to encourage you to do that. But here's number 6. You ready? If we're going to have genuine commitment, we have to have an uncommon behavior. An uncommon behavior. In other words, as best we can, we want to be at peace with everybody. Listen to what Paul says. He says, live in harmony with everyone. Do not be proud, but be willing to associate with those in low positions. He says, do not be arrogant. He says, never repay evil for evil, but always being careful to do what is right in the eyes of everyone. And then listen to verse 18, and this has to do with an uncommon behavior. He says, if it is possible at all for you, and if it depends on you, live at peace with everyone. You know, we live in a society where people are always attacking each other. Right now, we're in the presidential season. We're seeing people attack people online and social media and Twitter and this and that. And we can't even have an honest debate without an argument or a fight. You know what? As a child of God, if you want your relationships to flourish, your number one goal in every relationship is this: as far as it depends on you, live at peace with all men. That's an uncommon behavior, and I want you to know, when people see that in your heart and that in your life, I want you to know it'll change your relationships. And here's number 7. We have to have an uncommon reflex. We have to have an uncommon reflex. In other words, we have to respond to hostile actions with love and compassion. We have to respond to hostile actions with love and compassion. Paul in Romans chapter 12, verse 19, he says, do not take revenge, my dear friends, but leave room for God to work in someone's life. Then he goes further, uncommon reflex, an uncommon reaction. He says, if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he is thirsty, give him some water. Never, he says, let evil overcome you, but instead overcome evil with good. Now, what do you mean an uncommon reflex, Pastor? You know, if someone's your enemy and you find out that things are not going well for them, they're hungry, they've lost their job, the natural response is to be glad, right? I mean, let's be honest. We want our enemies to lose. But Paul says, as a child of God, one of our uncommon reflexes, a spiritual reflex, not a natural reflex, is that if we see our enemy hurting, we meet their need. If they're hungry, feed them. If they're thirsty, give them something to drink. And then he says, in doing so, you will not let evil overcome your relationship, but you instead will overcome the evil with good. And so those are 7 principles on having an uncommon love in a world filled with broken relationships. Those are 7 keys to having great relationships God's way. Now, as we think about our relationships, I'm going to encourage you to do this. Give yourself a grade right now on all of your relationships. Spiritually, on a scale of 1 to 10, where you at? 10 being perfect, the best relationship you've ever had, 1 being not very good. Between 1 and 10, spiritually, where are you? What about relationally? What about with your friendships? Are your friendships a 5? Are they a 10? Are they a 1? Where are they? And then also maritally, if you're married, where are your relationships? Where's your married relationship? Is it a 10? Is it a 5? Is it a 3? Whatever it is. And then ask yourself the question, once you've graded those three relationships, spiritually, friendships, relationally, and maritally, then ask yourself the question, what can I do to improve those relationships? And then here's the key, do it. Do it. As we close, if you would like to see this entire sermon that I preached on Sunday morning, you can find it on our website. Take care, God bless you, and we'll see you next time.